Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to AI for Good. My name is Bastiaan Kwast from the ITU, the International Telecommunication Union, and it is my privilege to introduce today's session on AI in the Middle East and North Africa, Visions and Perspectives. ITU is the United Nations Specialized Agency for Information and Communication Technologies, and is also the organizers of AI for Good, together with ACM, XPRIZE, 38 UN sister agencies, and co-convened with Switzerland. For today's session, we're counting on your active participation, and for this we have the Q&A functionality, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. Please post any questions in that window. Additionally, there is the chat functionality, which you can use to communicate with other participants today in the webinar. Please make sure to send your message to all panelists and attendees so that everybody can see your messages. And with that, it is now time for me to hand it over to our moderator for today. Kanta, hi, how are you?
Hello, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm honoured to be back at an AI for Good event, albeit virtually, 3 years after I launched the Global AI Narratives Research Project at the in-person AI for Good Global Summit in Geneva in 2018. And I'm still grateful for that opportunity, not in the least, because at that event I met Professor Nagla Rizk, who has become one of our most important collaborators on the research project and the co-author of the report we are launching here today. So my name is Kanta Dihal. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence, or CFI for short, at the University of Cambridge. And CFI is an interdisciplinary research centre founded in 2016, focused on the nature, ethics and impact of artificial intelligence. And Global AI Narratives developed from a project that my colleague Stephen Cave started in 2016 called AI Narratives. In that original project, we investigated the portrayals and perceptions of AI in the English-speaking world. So we examined the dominant narratives and how they stereotype the technology, those who build it, and those who are affected by it. We started with that cultural sphere because it's disproportionately influential. For instance, it pervades the AI research of Silicon Valley. And unlike many other new technologies, AI arrives with millennia of expectations that shape the technology's development, deployment, and reception. And through such long history, these narratives have not only influenced the public at large, but they've also steered the expectations of those who grew up to become AI researchers. And the project evidenced some serious problems in the ways in which we talk about AI now. I'm sure that much of this is familiar to you, so I'll be very brief about this, but from the start, our research has focused on the extent to which portrayals of intelligent machines are anthropomorphized, made to look like humans, and correspondingly gendered and racialized. And intelligent machines have never been portrayed as just tools. They've instead always been agents and as such have taken on human roles, such as servant or soldier, but also social roles and relationships, such as friend, lover, child, parent, which positions them within very complex social hierarchies. But at the same time, as these machines are taking on human roles, they are both exaggerated in some dimensions and flattened in others. As soldiers, they're hyper-masculine, as lovers, hyper-feminine. They're supposed to show initiative and intelligence in their roles, but at the same time be unthinkingly loyal slaves. So those are the themes in the Hollywood hegemony. But are there alternatives to those stories? Or is it inevitable that we imagine intelligent machines this way? Now, although much AI technology and the AI narratives are developed in Silicon Valley and Hollywood, the West is not the only place to ever have imagined the existence of intelligent machines or its impact on society. And comparative research looking at different religious, linguistic, philosophical, literary, cinematic traditions can make us better understand those narratives and indicate alternatives. And this is what we set out to do when we set up the Global AI Narratives Project. It emphasizes the narratives outside the English-speaking West, including narratives from countries that have AI technologies imposed on them from outside and rising AI superpowers. The project convened a series of 20 workshops around the world, which moved online at the start of the pandemic. And through these workshops, we've developed a global network of people who work and think in the field of AI narratives in the broadest sense. And in October 2019, we held what turned out to be the final in-person Global AI Narratives workshop before the pandemic at the American University Cairo in partnership with Dr. Nagla and her team. And today, we are releasing the report that came out of this workshop and our subsequent joint research. Our starting point in that report is that the Middle East and North Africa, or MENA region, is hugely overlooked by the Western mainstream when it comes to discussing the future of artificial intelligence. We identified several narrative threads as pivotal to the understanding of the Middle Eastern and North African conceptions of futures with intelligent machines, which include colonialism, visions of a utopian past rather than a future, contemporary political turmoil, as well as technological determinism and gender roles. So I'll highlight a few of our key findings in the report. First of all, Western perceptions of success, development, progress, and industrialization strongly influence the hopes and dreams for the future of technology in the region. But the history of imagining intelligent machines in MENA dates back to the Islamic Golden Age, a period of cultural, scientific, and economic flourishing between the 9th and 14th centuries. And yet we found that today, Islam does not feature in the wider discussion about AI's implications for society and culture in MENA. The anthropomorphization of both fictional and real AI in the region tends to reinforce gender stereotypes. Robots are often imagined as servants, usually in the form of feminized domestic helpers. And that's a tendency that raises further questions on the adoption of AI in relation to gender. And we conclude that the influence of narratives on the future of AI and other emerging technologies is significant in the MENA region. But compared with the Anglophone world, this influence of narratives is less explicit in the region. And uncovering it requires a very nuanced approach, which takes into consideration not only directly expressed stories as such, so novels, films, media coverage, but also more elusive imaginaries that are, for instance, embodied by the local startup ecosystems or online communities of futurists, among others. So before moving on to our speakers for today, I'll first express my thanks to the other co-authors of this report, Tomas Holanek, Nadine Waheba, and Stephen Cave, and to the advisors and peer reviewers who've made it the work it is today, with special thanks to Gina Alashkar for her work on the Arabic translation of the report. So with me today are Professor Nagla Rizk and Professor Mohammed Zahran, who peer reviewed the report. Nagla Rizk is Professor of Economics and Founding Director of the Access to Knowledge for Development Centre, or A2K4D, at the American University in Cairo's School of Business. Her research area is the economics of knowledge, digital technology, and development in the Middle East and Africa. And her recent work focuses on the economics of data, AI, and inclusion, with interest in gender and the future of work. Mohammed Zahran is a professor with the Computer Science Department at the Courant Institute of Mathematical Sciences at New York University. He received his PhD in electrical and computer engineering from the University of Maryland at College Park in 2003. His research interests span several aspects of computer hardware architecture. But beside research and teaching, he's also interested in the history and philosophy of science and writes regularly about them in some of the Egyptian newspapers. So I will now hand over first to Professor Nagla, who will go into more detail on several specific issues surrounding AI narratives in the MENA region. Thank you very much. Over to you, Nagla.
Thank you very much, Kanta. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, good evening. It's a pleasure to be back to AI for Good, and I'm very grateful for the organizers for giving us the opportunity to share the results of our report. And my sincere thanks also to Mohammed Zahran and for my team at the center and my co-authors of the report. As Kanta mentioned, this report originated, the thinking for this report when we were at AI for Good Summit in 2018. And after the workshop workshop that we hosted and organized in 2019. The work developed into the report that we have between our hands today. If you will allow me, I'm going to share my screen. I have a few slides to share with you. So let me just, this is, okay, this is the, we're very proud to have the Arabic translation of the report as well. So both pictures of which you see on the screen. The report, the workshop that we held in 2019 actually had different specializations. We had different people from academia, from civil society, from advocacy in multidisciplinary fields, ranging from literature, history, art, engineering, economics, philosophy, medicine, law, you name it. And it was a very interesting and useful exercise that gave us the ammunition to write this report later on. So let me then, what I want to focus on today are a mix of 3 points, really 3 themes: misconceptions, stereotypes, biases. I'm going to talk about influences, and I'm going to talk about tensions. And I'm going to talk about these perhaps interchangeably, because as Kanta mentioned, the context of the Middle East and North Africa is quite nuanced. And the first theme that we cover in that area is we ask, do we have a technology desert? Do we have an AI desert? Do we have a situation where technology is hardly ever there? What is the situation there? Or do we have oasis? Do we have points of stories of happenings of technology, of AI that reflect the reality that we have around us? And if so, what kind of oasis do we have? Do we have something like the Dubai Future, the Museum of the Future in Dubai with the highest technologies? Do we have parts where there are initiatives to use technology that is adopted from the West? Or do we have homegrown solutions? The Middle East and North Africa is a diverse region. It is not homogeneous. We have a huge diversity in economic and human resources, and for sure in the technological capabilities. And what is modern? What is it Western? Is it Eastern? Is it historic? Is it homegrown? So we look, as Kanta quite right mentioned, we look into the influence of colonialism on the culture and the representations of AI narratives in the region, and we argue that exploitation associated with colonialism and subsequent conflict stripped colonial countries of their ability to imagine their own future. What kind of future is being represented? We are looking actually at narratives as resistance. Imagining the future becomes a political act. It becomes a statement of how to decolonize and how to resolve struggles. For example, we look at narratives, stories, Palestine plus 100, that looks at Palestine 100 years in 2014 and what it would look like. We look at Iraq plus 100 in 2103, 100 years after the invasion in 2003. We look at Egyptian series that's called An-Nihaya, or The End, that actually looks at futuristic manner of the state of the region in the year 2120, portraying future with robots and cyborgs interact and maybe clash with human beings from a futuristic perspective. We are very proud of 3 essays that we hosted on our blog series at the Access to Knowledge for Development Center called Speculative Data Futures. We look at women, written by women, about futuristic perspectives of women, applications by women for women reclaiming urban spaces through open data in Palestine. We look at urban planning in Syria, and we look at women using data applications for sexual harassment in Egypt. Examples that to show what we have in the region. We had the author of Al-Barah, which is the first Arabic AR and hologram novel that again looks at a futuristic perspective of the Arab world, but also touches on the Arab Spring spirit and what the Arab world would be after the Arab Spring. The region is unique. It has uncertain futures, uncertain present, tumultuous conditions in the present, struggles, political, cultural, and economic. And with all of this, with a cautious view of the increased ubiquity of technology and digitization, how does the future look like? It's quite complex. And when we think of tensions and usage of digital technologies amidst tensions, this reminds us of what we witnessed in Egypt and in Tunisia. These 2 pictures I took myself, one of them in Tahrir Square and the other in Avenue Bourguiba in Tunis, one in Cairo, one in Tunis. portraying digital technologies, ground-up initiatives that are taking place by people in bringing, in resistance, in using technology as means of resistance, as means of expression. Now, this kind of tension, the grounds-up voices trying to find a place for themselves amidst top-down dynamics and top-down pressures, may that be from governments, from politics, but sometimes also from hegemony of large corporations. It is not new for us. Kanta mentioned the golden age of Islam and the culture, the Arab culture, the history of imagination, imaginaries, 1001 Nights, Misbah Alauddin Aladdin's lamp, fascinating writings and cultural expressions. Also more recent works, examples from the Egyptian Society for Science Fiction, where we had a representative in our workshop. We have stories like The Spider by Dr. Mustafa Mahmoud. We have the stories of the Great Space Saga, Half Humans. We have a rich history of representation, of cultural representation. So it's not really a desert, but we need to be cognizant of the expressions that we have, look for them and try to study them. Then comes our robots today. We had Dr. Nicholas Mavridis on our workshop, and he created the first Arabic-speaking robot, Ibn Sina, named after the Islamic philosopher Avicenna, which is a representation of wisdom and Arabic and Islamic thought. Another robot that we have today is Zaki. Zaki is an Arabic for intelligent or smart, which is a chatbot by one of the commercial banks in Egypt. But then we have Ruby. Ruby is an example of a robot that is a servant, is a female servant that came out in one of the series in Egypt in the 80s. And then, of course, we have Sophia. That picture I took at the AI for Good Summer 3 years ago, and I had the pleasure of interviewing Sophia. So what are we, what is the situation? What are we saying about gender, about women in our part of the world? Sophia has, my understanding, it has Arab citizenship. So we need a deeper look into gender roles. Is it Ruby or is it Sophia? But that's also a reflection of the diversity and the challenges that we have on the ground today. So we have misconceptions, stereotypes, and biases. The Arab world, for example, has 70% females in STEM education, but only 12% females in technology work. So there is this question mark. Females are part of the STEM education, but they're not makers of code. The percentage, they're not well represented in the makers of code. That clearly can reflect in biases in technology, which can translate eventually into perhaps biased policy making. So misconceptions, stereotypes, biases, influences, East, West, is it Western technology? We also have influence of the East. Is it homegrown? Tensions, grounds up, the top down. So it is a complex region, and we try in our report to detangle these issues, looking into them into more detail. Perhaps the takeaways from our report, I try to summarize them. One, the soft power of technology as a means of expression. We do have a unique storytelling environment with a complicated past and present. And then, of course, what do we foresee in the future? We have a history of imagining intelligent machines dating back to the Islamic Golden Age, yet Western perceptions influence hopes and future dreams. And now with COVID, what do we have? What is our thinking with AI, data, health? What do we see the future of digital technologies, robots, AI, the narratives that we have in this part of the world into the future? And we conclude that it's essential to look for the expression of local hopes for technological futures in grounds-up initiative societies, art projects, startups, rather than top-down orchestrated efforts to drive innovation, as they often respond to Western conceptions of progress. Thank you very much. I will stop there. I'll be very happy to take questions. Back to you, Kanta.
Thank you so much, Nagla. And so over to our next speaker, Professor Mohammad Sakhan.
Okay, hi everybody. Now from my nerdy, geeky point of view, since I am a computer scientist and engineer, okay, if we look at the countries in the MENA region, and actually any developing country, we'll see that when it comes to technology in general, we are facing some problems. But with the problems, we also have some opportunities. And to move from problems to opportunities, we have to move within some constraints. So we have three keywords that we need to discuss: problems, opportunities, and constraints. So what are these problems? First, many countries, many developing countries have a fear to be left behind by the Western world. So we are trying to imitate many of the technologies there. For example, we started to hear about AI in our MENA region after it appeared in westernized world. So we didn't start it ourselves, even though there have been a lot of researchers working in artificial intelligence in the MENA countries for decades. So fear to be left behind. Another thing is fear to be manipulated by the new technology. So a lot of people are thinking, oh, the AI will come and take our jobs and all of that stuff. So this is a problem. Or basically, we are not very strong in technology. So if we use this technology in our life, maybe we'll be under the influence of the other stronger countries and all of that stuff. But this is the second fear. The third fear is fear of lack of knowledge. Oh, we cannot do this. We don't have the required knowledge and all of that kind of stuff. So these are the problems. Three fears: fear to be left behind, fear to be manipulated by the technology, fear that we'll be embarrassed because lack of knowledge. Now, what are the opportunities? The opportunities is that all these three fears are totally wrong. Nowadays, with the strong communication media, we have access to any knowledge we need. And we have a lot of very good researchers in the MENA regions. I myself, I work with grad students here in Egypt, and they are publishing very good work while staying here. Okay, so this means we have the knowledge, and they publish in top venues, which means we don't have to be embarrassed. We cannot be left behind because the technology or the knowledge is not classified. Actually, what is classified in westernized world is the usage of technology, but not the technology itself. So we have access to technology wherever we want. And we have the tools. For example, to train an artificial intelligence or a machine learning neural network, we need strong machines. You may say, okay, we don't have strong machines here. Yes, but you have access to strong machines many places in the world, and many of them are giving you access to these machines for free or for very low price. If you look at Amazon, AWS, Microsoft, Azure, Google, I mean, you have access. So you have access to knowledge, you have access to tools, okay? And even, let me go one step further. Artificial intelligence has been around since the Dartmouth workshop in 1957, yet it didn't become a buzzword until 2012. Why in 2012? Because the technology became, or the hardware became so strong that it can run this type of software. So hardware, people in the MENA region have been afraid of going into the hardware because, oh, we cannot fabricate these things and all of that stuff. Many of the very big companies in hardware do not have any fabrication tools at all, or not tools, I mean fabs, basically, to make the chips. They can just design, and the design is an IP by itself, and then they can just send it to TSMC or Taiwan or something to design the chips. So we can design the hardware. We just need to have brains, machines. We have access to knowledge. We have access to hardware. So all of these fears, the three fears, are not really correct. So these are the opportunities. Now we have access to everything. Now, what are the constraints? The constraints is that you have to work within a political ecosystem and within economical ecosystems, because now all the big companies are multinational. So what exactly they will be giving you? What are you allowed to do in your region? What you are not allowed to do in your regions? What if you do this type of research with this country, the other country would not be happy, and so on. All of these kind of things, we have to play a little bit of politics and economics. I mean, this is a big issue by itself, but I will not go into that depth. So at the end, problems, opportunities, and constraints. The main takeaway, one sentence, we can do it. That's it.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. So if I may ask the first question, I see that there are some questions coming into the Q&A already that we'll get to in a second. Thank you very much for asking them and keep them coming. But one question I wanted to start with is the issue of the self-perceived narrative of lack or decline in many MENA countries. So the idea that the region lacks resources, innovation and ideas to seize the opportunities offered by new technologies. Now, both of you have shown that in so many different ways, there is no lack and decline. This narrative does not seem to be correct at all. So what do you think can or should be done in order to change that self-perception? And also, where does it come from?
Agla, you can.
Okay, I'll just mention a few points. I think the region has a unique, asset. It could be a liability, but it can be turned very strongly into an asset. The region is predominantly young. This is a region of young people who have education or reasonably well educated. You have high percentages of university graduates. So ironically, at the same time, you have a region that has the highest rates of youth unemployment and women's unemployment and unemployment of the educated. So that's immediately one key that can give us, an opening. You can open a door once if there are the proper policies to channel those energies of young people into areas. You mentioned startups, Kanta, which we talk about in the report quite rightly. People are always talking about startups and entrepreneurship, but it does not always have to be the fancy startups and entrepreneurship. There could be initiatives, simple initiatives that with simple technologies that can engage young people, again, away from the main centers, from the main cities. We always think, Cairo, Alexandria, and also in other parts of the Arab world. This is a wealth. The young people, the youth is a wealth, and we have an educated youth. So this is certainly one way of engaging the creativity, unlocking the creativity of the young to actually portray and showcase what this wealth that we actually have, and it is an untapped potential. I would say, Mohammed, would you like to go ahead?
Yes, maybe I can add my 2 cents here. I think in the Arab world, we need to do 2 things. First is we need to put a spotlight on all the successful initiatives and startups, especially the ones in technology. And we have many. But the thing is, what happens when a startup does something is that we'll just put a Facebook note or something like this. If we put a very big spotlight, so people will know that they can do it, that we have the technology. The second thing is we need to build an awareness that technology is there. We don't need to travel abroad and buy some expensive technology or be under the impressions that some of the technology are hidden and we cannot have them and all of that stuff. Everything can be done through the internet, even writing code, running them or training neural networks on very big machines that are somewhere overseas. We have access to technology. We just need brain and time. And because of this time thing, there is, economics. Because if somebody, and those bright young minds, if they don't have enough salary, they will have to, after graduating, they will have to work in many different jobs in order to meet their end needs. In that case, they will not have time to do that. So the main thing is time, but everything else is there.
And there's encouraging words. I will go to a question from Haya Al-Zayat. Is the fact that women are not as included in the making of code a direct reflection of the gender biases we see in today's algorithms and policymaking in the region? For example, in Egypt, when COVID digital payments were being made, most jobs that were available to receive these cash transfers were inherently male jobs. How could we combat this?
That's a great question. I'll take a dive at that. One of the things that took place indeed after the COVID hit in Egypt, Egypt is also has a high, like elsewhere in the Arab world, a high rate of informal employment, very high rates of informal, the informal sector is predominant. And these were the ones that were hardly hit with COVID-19 because there was a supply and demand. This is the informal sector in Egypt has actually shouldered Egypt in previous crises. It has shouldered Egypt in the financial crisis, in the uprisings during the Arab Spring, but not this time. This time, the informal sector was really hit hard, both by demand and supply factors. So there was definitely a cut in demand for the services, and the supply of workers themselves. Some areas were quarantined, and the obvious explanation of people being held back by illness. So what the government did was initiate a program for cash handouts for informal workers, which is a good initiative. The problem here, there were different layers of barriers preventing women in particular from accessing that. First, it was done online. So that's the first barrier, because automatically you have a digital divide. Not everybody has access, and usually women's access is less. Then also the reality is we have illiteracy. People cannot read and write. And again, this would be higher for females. So what happened was that even within that, females sought help of civil society to help them fill out the form online. But when it came time to fill out the form and sort of there were a drop-down menu of jobs, the jobs were all male, carpenter, welder, and women were other. So this is an example, and I'm glad this example was brought up here, because this is an example where women are really sort of invisible to the data ecosystem, if you will. Now, once women are absent from the data ecosystem, that's one layer, that's one bias to start with. And then we look at makers of code, and if women are not engaging actively with making of code, that's another layer of leaving out women. So eventually women will become invisible. And if your data, there's data invisibility and a data blur, then this really leaves women behind. So to be positive and to look at again, on the positive side, we do, as a region, we have high percentages of women in STEM. I guess the next step would be women's employability in the technology sector, which would certainly require, active steps, positive steps to engage in that aspect, not only to humanize the algorithm, but also to put and make sure that women are active makers of code. And I will stop here and hand it to my colleague, the technology expert. I'm sure he has points to make. Thank you.
Well, I don't know what to add after all what you said, but let me, because I have seen in the question that was asked, the problem of white males directing things. So let me handle this regarding AI itself. And for this, I would like to draw the attention to a nice book that was relatively recent, 2019, written by Amy Webb. It's called The Big Nine. And the word Big Nine means the biggest 9 companies who are doing AI research. 6 of them are in the United States and 3 are in China. And one of the points that Amy Webb mentioned there is that, okay, when we mention AI, actually we mention machine learning, which means a piece of software that we have to train with some data. Then when it sees new situation, it can, do some autonomous action about it, oversimplifying the stuff, but this is it. Her main point is, who is training this neural network? Usually they are white male. And this means that even though the machine itself doesn't have biases, but the training data is biased. So one of the very important things that we have to do, besides of course all the politics and steps that Nagla mentioned, is that we have to have unbiased data for training. And that's all what I can add to this. And that book is very nice one in general, because Amy Webb is a co-founder of the Future Institute, and she teaches forecasting at NYU. So she's making prediction about what AI will look like in 2029, 49, and 69. So and she puts 3 scenarios in each. So it's an interesting one.
Oh, that's a very interesting reading recommendation. Thank you. So that's Amy Webb's The Big Nine.
Yeah.
I have a follow-up question on this. Nagla, you mentioned there are very high numbers and proportionately of women being educated in STEM in the MENA region, but not working in STEM subsequently. So what happens? What goes wrong? and why? And what are the options for women? I mean, this sounds very much like the leaky pipeline issue that is also such a problem in the US, the UK, many other Western countries, although there seems to be a much narrower pipeline to begin with. Here in the English-speaking world, we don't start off with a majority women in a given STEM classroom in the first place. We have these problems of much lower participation by women much earlier on. So there seems to be a very different situation here, and I was wondering how there can be such a drastic, major difference between the classroom and the working world.
I think it's an analog explanation. I mean, it's really goes back to the social norms and cultural norms and the roles that females take up in this part of the world, being 100% responsible for, housework and looking after children, which is changing with time, but we're not there yet. It is global, as you say, so it's not unique to this part of the world, but perhaps we still have the prevalence of women taking up the bulk of childcare and house looking after homemaking basically. And perhaps this does not it precludes women from engaging actively in a field that is very fast, that is dynamic, that requires certain kind of commitment. This would be my understanding. And unless there are active steps to actually engage women in this work, but also the change in the culture. If there is gradually, a change in the culture towards allowing women more space in the workplace, this could translate to perhaps more of that. Mohammed, any thoughts?
No, I don't have enough information about the issue here.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, there are a few more questions have come in, and thank you very much for sending them in. Here's a question by Khadija Hassan. What are some key factors which distinguish top-down narratives from the government about AI from more grassroots expressions of AI? So I guess that one is mostly aimed at Nagla.
Thank you, Kanta, and thank you, Khadija, for the question. I would think from my experience working with people in the field in this part of the world is that usually, startups or entrepreneurs who work in small companies tend to rely sometimes on open source technologies, tend to be more collaborative, tend to engage, be more dynamic and more flexible, which opens the door to engage more youth. Usually the narrative, from my experience, when it is working with a government entity, they tend to lean towards working with large corporations, and this sort of has a reflection in the intellectual property world, like with proprietary, IT companies. And at the end of the day, this may not be as inclusive as the initiatives that are taken by small dynamic startups that are more inclusive of youth and whatnot, and women and people perhaps in more remote parts of the world. So I would look at this as an opportunity for encouraging competition, for encouraging small players, which is actually fulfilling the promise of the digital economy in sort of expanding horizontally and being inclusive rather than perpetuating hierarchies in narratives that rely on large corporations. So these are my 2 cents. Thank you.
Mohammed, what is your view on this? Because you mentioned the also more positive role that larger corporations could play in the region, especially with regard to access to hardware, for instance.
Okay, well, first, let's look at the big picture. Governments usually are trying to please the international organizations for political and economical reasons, which is totally understandable. So they have different strategy. I cannot say 100% different, but different goals than the people who are doing startups, the national who are doing small companies. However, those small companies themselves are using the technologies by the big multinational companies. So there is something in common here, okay? The government may go and talk with Google CEO, for example, but the startups are using Google technology. Here we are at the top part, we are looking at policies. At the bottom, we are talking about technologies. So at least we have something in common here. So I think there must be some kind of discussion between the top and the bottom, because it will make the best use of this multinational thing. This is my 2 cents too.
So essentially, would you say that startups are not as, or cannot be entirely grassroots? They always will rely on the infrastructure laid out by these multinationals?
Yes, I mean, because these are the constraints that I mentioned earlier, because you have a constraints, for example, for the internet speed. It's not about paying a lot of money or anything. You are basically using the cable that is, under the oceans that goes from India to us and then there. So this has a highest capacity. This is your upper bound. So you have to make use of something like this. However, let me put the grassroots here into 2 groups, the startups and the researchers in universities. The researchers in universities, they have a little bit more freedom because they can think, they can, try, something very futuristic and all of that stuff, because they are sitting at universities, publishing papers and getting insights. And then the startups are taking whatever we can use from this to build technologies that we can use to solve national problems. We don't want to solve somebody else's problems. And this is a very important point, both at universities and startups, because you have 2 types of research. The research for pride, we are publishing in Nature or in Science and all of that stuff, but you are not solving, your country's problem. And then the research that solves local problems, this may not lead to very strong publications, but they will lead to some other advances. So this is one of the things that requires also the collaboration with universities. How do you promote, the researchers and the professors? Because this will have an effect on the science and the technology, and at the end, the big picture. It may be surprising, but it is, it's needed.
Yes, that's an excellent point about you don't want to be solving someone else's problems, especially when you've got problems of your own to solve, which we all do. This links very well to a new question that just came in by Nagam El-Husami from A2K4D. Hi, Nagam. Who asks, I see AI adoption in the Middle East, even if adaptations of Western models, as an opportunity for addressing local developmental needs. In fact, this model presents an opportunity that developing countries specifically should utilize to their advantage. Thoughts on this? Nagla?
Sure. Thanks, Nagam, for the question. Certainly. I mean, again, we go back to the AI for good, to the the predecessor ICT 4D. It is really important that we use the technologies to fulfill the developmental promise, if you will. One of the things that is actually really important in AI strategies is looking at what is AI used for. And I remember reviewing the strategy for India and working on the one for Egypt, and always bearing in mind the objective being to address development problems. So certainly there is a need to use, the Western technology for sure. I go back to the point about startups and small companies. The advantage of having small companies is the flexibility. And what comes to my mind is, for example, novel data collection mechanisms, the ability to use innovative data collection mechanisms in data-driven innovation. That would be one way to, yes, at the end of the day, you would be using technology, but you would also, Western technology, but you would also be using your own flavor and being dynamic enough and flexible enough. Small gives flexibility in finding novel solutions. Like, for example, there was in Egypt an initiative called Harass Map that used crowdsourced data on harassment for supporting females, for example. That started quite a few years ago, and it was quite innovative. at the very start of using data for helping women in Egypt, for example. So even though there's nothing wrong with Western technology, it's great. The point is, what would it be used for, and to be adapted for a solution, as Mohammed said, and you said, Kanta, for a solution and an initiative that is homegrown. It's really important to give those homegrown initiatives because they do have a chance for inclusion and for finding adapting technologies for local to solve local problems. Thank you.
Mohammed, any further thoughts? Or shall I?
Just two small points. The first, actually, Nagla made an excellent point here. We can start by using the Western technology, but not necessarily the Western data. Because at the end, when we say artificial intelligence, people these days means really machine learning. And machine learning is a kind of neural network that has to be trained with data. So the first thing is we need to collect our own data, our own unbiased data. And we will use this data to train the neural networks that we are getting. So we are using the technology, but with a different data. This is the first problem, or the first point that I want to make. The second is actually related to, I think, 2 or 3 years old article in Harvard Business Review, which discusses when does your business need machine learning? Because now I can see any kiosk in the street, they want to introduce machine learning in their business, and really all what they need is a linear regression. So basically, we need to educate the people when a sophisticated machine learning is needed, when a linear regression is better, and when nothing at all is actually the best. So the technology is made to make our life easier, not to make our life look sophisticated. So this is one of the things that we need to be very aware of here.
Thank you. Now, I have a question. So we know that the MENA region is familiar with Hollywood AI narratives. The Terminator, for instance, of course, came up at our workshop. But Mohammed, as you pointed out when commenting on our report, China is now a major player in real AI development and becoming increasingly influential in the MENA region. So how does China and how do Chinese visions and ideas about artificial intelligence influence the way people imagine the future with AI or without it in the MENA region?
Okay, first let's take movies as an example. The first thing about movies is that it has to appeal to people. And in order that it appeals to people, there must be some villains. So this is why it will always show the AI as the bad thing, and there must be a war. Terminator is like this, Star Wars, Star Trek, even if you go down, Transcendence, Johnny Depp, like a few years back, all of this must, otherwise the movie will be really boring. It will be more a documentary than a real movie. So we have to take this economical part into things. Of course, the part that is flavored by Westernized thing is that it makes always the Western country the strong one, the one that will save the world and all of that stuff. So this is the kind of the soft power that we say. China, on the other hand, cannot use that same technique. Why is that? Because most of the world is not really used to the Chinese movies at the end, but they are using a different way of influencing that thing, which is basically economy and technology. How come? If you look at the Silk Road, the new one, not the history, you will find that China is helping a lot of countries in Africa all the way down by giving them a lot of technologies, a lot of financing some projects and all of that stuff. So this means two things. First, these countries will not be able to say no to anything that China asks for. This is one thing. This is politics. I mean, you are getting money from these countries. You are a poor country, so then you cannot say no. The second thing is that the Silk Road itself will be filled up with a lot of sensors and Internet of Things, which means that China will be collecting huge amount of data that it can be used to whatever it wants to use. Okay, so given these two things, it doesn't need to do movies, right?
Fair point. Nagla, what are your views and understandings of the role of China?
I have very little to add after Mohammed, but let me just say, just the impressions that, talking about narratives, that the fact that, came across a couple of apps, like one called Uyun, which is police without policemen. Uyun means eyes, which is a facial recognition and surveillance program initiated in Dubai, powered by Chinese multinational technology Huawei. So the fact that these technologies are available, and just the general sense that technologies related to surveillance or to there's also something about Hajj during the pilgrimage, something that would be used during pilgrimage in Saudi Arabia. This kind of narrative, if you will not really fare very positively. So I guess it would be countervailed by narratives of Chinese support for technologies for development. So if there are AI technologies to address development issues or to be used for, let's say, in the area of health or even for education, then these would be, again, we go back to the tensions and the narratives that are in this part of the world that would be really nuanced in giving you, sometimes there are positive narratives, sometimes there are negative narratives, and I guess the end result remains to be seen in the coming few years.
Thank you, Nagla. Just one thing to add on the point of there needs to be a villain. We have been seeing throughout the Global AI Narratives Project that while AI is often a convenient placeholder for that villain role, there are narrative traditions where that isn't the case, and which have led to very different perceptions of what life with AI could be like, particularly in Japan and South Korea, where the role of AI in these narratives that wide ranges of people are familiar with is much more positive, much more of AI in a supportive, friendly, buddy-like role. And in the 20th century, in communist countries, there was also a strong tradition of stories about AI with a role of helper, of being subservient to the humans overseeing it, but still assisting them in creating a better life, a better world for them. So there are those possibilities, especially as we heard in the workshop, that the influence of Japanese narratives, of anime and manga, is also quite strong in the MENA region.
But which movies actually brought more monies to their creators? This is about, this is why I think, I don't say that we don't have these type of movies. We have, and we want to have more, but then we have to be aware that from an economical point of view, they are not the ones that are really action-packed that people wants to see while traveling or while relaxing and all of that stuff. So it's not like we don't have them. We have them, but money talks, unfortunately.
Oh, very, very true. As part of this narratives research, my own team is working on an analysis of the about 1,400 most influential films featuring AI worldwide, of which there are, in terms of sheer revenue, very few non-Western ones, but results pending. We have a question from Dana Al-Bashbishi. In recent years, we always see new feminine robots, such as Sophia. Is there a difference in the gendering of new technologies in different regions?
That's, Mohammed, go ahead.
Well, let me be blunt here. I cannot be very optimistic. Why is that? Because that specific type of technology, you will not have access to it unless you have your own researchers who are doing these cybersecurity research and build their own tools. As long as you keep buying tools from the Western world, you will be under their influence. And remember something, there is a new type of computing that is brewing up. It's not yet out, maybe 5 to 10 years, called quantum computing. The quantum computing If successful, it will break all of the encryptions that we have now. Most of the encryptions that we have now are called RSA encryption. And big supercomputers cannot break it easily. But with quantum computing, which is total different type of technology, these things can be broken. And this is why there are a lot of people now, in the US at least, this is where I work, they have post-quantum security. They are trying to build up some kinds of securities that will come after the quantum computing arrives. So as long as we don't catch up with this, then we need to be very innovative when it comes to cybersecurity, because at the end you are connected to the internet. You cannot tell the people do not connect to the internet. And as long as you are hooked to the internet, everything can be done, right? I mean, I think the First World War was about chemistry. The Second World War was about physics. The Third World War will be in cyberspace. This is the thing. So we need to have our army here.
Kanta, may I comment on the gender? And then I would like to also, if I may, ask you to tell us from your experience in the AI narratives in the different culture. I just want to say, you know, commenting on the issue of Sophia the robot and Ruby, because these are two, you know, opposite examples of female representation in robots in this part of the world. And they only reflect the paradoxes that we have in our culture, really. I mean, at the end of the day, the narratives and how we see robots, we see Zaki, the robot of the bank, as the intelligent, we see Ibn Sina as the philosopher. But when it comes to women, we have two extreme examples. You know, it's Sophia, the you know, well-known global robot, and we have Ruby, you know, the server. So again, it is a question, the narratives reflect cultures. And at the end of the day, whatever paradoxes and inconsistencies we have in our own culture, it will show in representations of the narratives. But I would love if you can also tell us from your experience, having seen the narratives in different cultures, what you think about that. Thank you.
Absolutely. And just to note that we are getting very close to the end of our session. So I will briefly get into this, and I'm afraid then after that it is time to close today's report launch. So on gendering artificial intelligence, as Nagla said, this very much reflects in every culture the paradoxes, but also the systems of justice and injustice, of freedom and oppression that every culture has. And that in terms of gender, in nearly all cultures across the world, has a long history of inequality. And that history of gender inequality seems to be reproduced around the world throughout history in depictions of intelligent machines, where if we go back more than 2,000 years, nearly 3,000 years to the first depiction of something like artificial intelligence in the Greek Iliad by Homer, we see the servants of the Greek god Hephaestus, who are gendered female. Shortly after that, we see the bronze knight Talos, who defends the island of Crete, who is gendered male. And a little later, we have the myth of Pygmalion and Galatea and of its metamorphoses. So this is the story of an artificial woman made out of ivory. The sculptor falls in love with her. She turns into a real woman, and that story has inspired more directly various AI narratives in the English-speaking world and beyond, as recently as the 20th and 21st century. So those are all narratives from around the Mediterranean, from several thousands of years ago. And because, as you can see from their influence, they too have not changed much in terms of their gender dynamics. It's really only very recently that across the world, as protests against gender inequality have become connected, networked, and have been given space, have been given platforms that alternative narratives have started to come up. But for every narrative that tries to undermine these gender stereotypes, there is a media hype around a gendered robot like Sophia. So this is an ongoing global struggle. And I am sorry to end on that negative note. But thank you all, everyone, for your fantastic questions that have inspired an excellent discussion. Thank you so much, Nagla and Mohammed, for joining me on the panel today. And I will now hand back to our organizers at ITU.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you all to our speakers today. That was a very interesting discussion. We hope you enjoyed the webinar, and we would like to launch a quick poll for you to say so. So we're launching that now. And in the meantime, let me mention a few things that may be of interest to you. So tomorrow we have another version of our Trustworthy AI series. And you can find the link in the chat. And there are several other interesting sessions that we're posting in the chat. Additionally, you can find more information on aiforgood.itu.int. And with that, I think we have reached the end of today. And thank you, and we hope to see you all tomorrow.
Rewind selector, rewind selector, rewind selector. Rewind selector, rewind selector, rewind selector.